I have two readings to share this morning. The first is from Elie Wiesel's story in his book, The Gates of the Forest. When the great rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov saw misfortune threatening the Jews, it was his custom to go into a certain part of the forest to meditate. There he would light a fire, say a special prayer, and a miracle would be accomplished and the misfortune averted. Later, when his disciple, the celebrated Maggid of Mezrich, had occasion for the same reason to intercede with heaven, he would go to the same place in the forest and say, Master of the universe, listen, I do not know how to light the fire, but I know the prayer. And again, the miracle would be accomplished. Still later, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sasov, in order to save his people once more, would go into the forest and say, I do not know how to light the fire. I do not know the prayer, but I know the place, and this must be sufficient. It was sufficient, and the miracle was accomplished. Then it fell to Rabbi Israel of Ridson to overcome misfortune. Sitting in his armchair, his head in his hands, he spoke to God. I am unable to light the fire, and I do not know the prayer. I cannot even find the place in the forest. All I can do is to tell the story, and this must be sufficient. And it was sufficient. God made human beings, Wiesel concludes, because God loves stories. The second reading is from the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the waters. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the deep. So, once upon a time, many years ago, when I was in college, I spent my summers working for the old Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range Railroad, the DM&IR for short. I was a Gandhi dancer, which is a fancy word for an unskilled laborer. I replaced old ties, laid new rails, and pounded a lot of spikes. It was good, hard work for a college kid, and I enjoyed it. I belonged to a union called the Brotherhood of the Maintenance of the Way, which always sounded to me like some esoteric religious cult. But believe me, the membership wasn't particularly distinguished for its piety. One summer, I was assigned to a section of track in an isolated wilderness area up near Finland, Minnesota. The three-man crew there maintained a short section of track that was used mostly to haul timber and pulpwood out of the forest. There wasn't much traffic at all on that line, maybe 2 or 3 trains per week. One Friday morning at 7 o'clock, our foreman told 2 of us to go up the track about 5 miles and oil some switches at a place called Sawbill Landing, where a train was due to pick up a load of wood later that morning. He told us to be back at the section house by 9:30 for coffee break, which would allow plenty of time for us to clear the track before the train came by. So my partner, Steve Smith, and I hopped onto our bright orange motor car and headed up the tracks. This motor car, or speeder as it was also called, had the kind of engine that needed to be started with a crank, which sometimes proved difficult, especially on those cool Minnesota mornings. But once we got going, it was definitely improvement over the old hand-pumped human-powered models. It only took us about a half an hour to get to Sawbill Landing and another half hour to clean and oil the switches. So after a brief excursion into a nearby meadow to pick our fill of newly ripened wild strawberries, we loaded up our tools, cranked the engine, reversed gears, and headed home. It was a pleasant but familiar ride through the woods. We were in no hurry to get back, And since Smitty was at the throttle, I reached into my lunchbox and took out my greasy, dog-eared paperback copy of Walden that I'd been reading. Before long, I was absorbed in Thoreau's meditations and only vaguely aware of the smell of the pine trees and the creosote-soaked ties flickering past underneath my feet. While he was at Walden Pond, Thoreau had lived near the old Fitchburg Railroad. Actually, it was the new Fitchburg Railroad at that time. And he had some interesting things to say about it. "The men on the freight trains," he wrote, "who go over the whole length of the road bow to me as to an old acquaintance. They pass me so often, and apparently they take me for an employee. And so I am. I, too, would fain be a track repairer somewhere in the orbit of the Earth." In another passage, he moralizes on the relationship between this new technology and society. "To do things railroad fashion," he says, "is now the byword, and it is worthwhile to be warned so often and so sincerely by any power to get off its track. Men are advertised that at a certain hour and minute, these bolts will be shot toward particular points of the compass, and it interferes with no one's business, and the children go to school on the other track. The air is full of invisible bolts," concludes Thoreau. "Keep on your own track, then." Now, doing things railroad fashion meant something very different for us Gandhi dancers. For example, in every DM&IR section house, there was posted a statement of the safety department's Rule 99. Be prepared for slack action. Now, slack action refers to that sudden jerk and heavy mechanical pulse that moves down a line of stationary railroad cars when a locomotive begins to pull on them, or the reverse action when a moving train comes to a stop. It's a fascinating thing to watch, but it can be deadly if you happen to be working between the cars and you aren't aware that the engine has gotten underway. Hence Rule 99. But we Gandhi dancers interpreted slack action in an entirely different sense. We thought it meant leisure time, and we were always prepared for that. In the unwritten code of the Brotherhood, DM and IR stood for "Don't move, I'm resting." And on this lazy summer morning, cruising smoothly along in our bright orange motor car, I was looking forward to some of that kind of slack. I was definitely not prepared for what did happen. As we rounded the last sharp corner before the section house, we looked up to see a train way ahead of schedule, bearing down on us. It was so close that I could see my own shock reflected in the engineer's eyes. I don't remember ever hearing a whistle. I looked across at Smitty, he looked at me, and we, without a word, we both leaped off our respective sides of the motor car. I scrambled up the steep embankment and turned to watch for one exquisitely expanded instant as our motor car sailed helplessly into a collision with the train. Collision is not quite the right word, though. It sounds somehow too violent. This scene wasn't violent at all. It was more like the pure expression of physical power, a vivid demonstration of the simple mathematical truth that force does equal mass times acceleration. I can assure you that's true, and I was thankful that my friend and I had been factored out of that particular equation. I watched as the motor car collapsed back upon itself like a crumpled beer can and began to disintegrate as the locomotive plowed it ahead along the tracks. The train wasn't very long, and it managed to come to a screeching stop with the caboose sitting on the tracks directly between me and Smitty, whose head I could see peeking from behind a bush on the opposite embankment, with his hard hat still firmly in place. The conductor stepped out of his office in the caboose. Some of you young ones may not know what a caboose is, but your parents can explain it. He came out to investigate the cause of this sudden slack action. Smitty and I skulked down from our hiding places and nervously walked over to where the conductor was standing. Moose Anderson was his name. And he was a veteran of the DM&R within a few years of retirement. He was an enormous man. His company issue coveralls, blue striped coveralls, looked like they'd been sewn together from the mattress ticking of an old double bed. He looked mean, and we were scared. All along the tracks, parts and pieces of our motor car were littered like discarded orange peels from some giant's lunch pail. As we stepped through the wreckage strewn alongside the tracks, I grew more and more anxious. Smitty and I huddled together for protection. Nobody seemed to be saying anything. Finally, we came to the head engine, and our motor car's chassis was smashed beyond recognition and still stuck to the front of the locomotive. And on the ground beside it lay the crank, twisted and mangled so badly out of shape that at first I didn't recognize it, but Moose did. And he reached down to pick it up. He examined it silently for a moment, turning it over and over in his hands, as if it were some curious work of modern art, sculpture. And finally, he held it out to Smitty and me and said, "Well, boys, start it up." Now, we've made our way into the very center of this sermon, which is, after all, supposed to be about beginning again. So let me begin again here by asking, what's the point and purpose of this story? Simply this: I think my story is not just about something that happened to me once upon a time. I think it's a story about all of us. I think we've all been hit by trains of one sort or another in our lives. Sooner or later, it happens to everyone. It comes with the very territory of being human. And the way we deal with such inevitable, self-shattering, traumatic experiences helps to shape our character and our very humanity. "The world breaks all of us," wrote Ernest Hemingway in A Farewell to Arms. "And afterward, some are strong at the broken places." The world breaks all of us. And afterward, some are strong at the broken places. We experience brokenness in many ways. A marriage disintegrates and ends in divorce. A close friend dies unexpectedly. A wanted pregnancy ends in a miscarriage. A trusted friend betrays us, or perhaps we betray someone else or ourselves. Maybe we experience the sudden shock of unemployment or the collapse of a business deal that we've worked on for months. The examples can be multiplied from your own experience. One way or another, we all know what it feels like to be stopped in our tracks, to be smashed by some power that bears down on us like a relentless locomotive. Now, of course, those experiences are not always as dramatic or as sudden as an actual train wreck. Sometimes we just run out of fuel and gradually grind to a halt, unable to make the next grade. In any case, whether we're overpowered by some external force or simply exhausted, the existential problem is one of deadly inertia, a stuckness, a spiritual paralysis, an inability to move any further with our lives. We find that we've come to a dead end. Like the protagonist of Dante's Divine Comedy, Dante's great poem begins with these words: in the middle of the journey of our life, I came to myself within a dark wood where the straight way was lost. In the hands of a great poet, what could be a mundane and even banal midlife crisis turns out to be a great work of art, an adventure of learning and transformation. Now, a midlife crisis is not restricted to those who are chronologically of middle age. Any life crisis, I believe, plunges us into the middle, into the very center of our lives, where our transforming work awaits us. And when these crises occur, whatever the concrete details may be, the religious question is always the same. Is it possible to overcome the deadly inertia, to reassemble the wreckage, to begin again? How is it possible to begin again? As much as we may want to, we can't go back to scratch. We simply can't find that sacred place in the virgin forest. We can never return to some blank slate, some pure primordial state of innocence, some absolute beginning. When God created Adam, wrote Wiesel in another story, he gave him a secret. That secret was not how to begin, for that prerogative is God's alone, but rather how to begin again. As human beings, we are always faced with the challenge of beginning again. In the midst of ongoing life, with the action already underway, no timeouts allowed, the trains won't stop for us, Thoreau noted. So how do we do that? How do we begin again? How do we pick up the pieces and start it up in the middle of things? I believe that we accomplish this best when we enter into the reality of stories, of symbols, of life-sustaining and affirming myth. Myths and symbols provide the raw materials out of which we can create and recreate the stories of our lives, and so find new possibilities and new directions for the future. Myth exists in a kind of trans-historical space outside of time, and this narrative transcendence, as I like to call it, gives us the possibility of seeing our lives in a larger perspective than our little local ego ordinarily allows. The words "once upon a time" have the power to transport us beyond the narrow confines of our current crisis and provide some leverage for changing things, including ourselves. The ancient Greek philosopher Archimedes used to boast that if he had a lever long enough and a place to stand, he could move the world. Now, Archimedes is generally credited as the founder of the science of mechanics, which is not my concern here. But I'd like to use that analogy and say that in the non-mechanical world, in the human world, the world of meanings and feelings and ideas and dreams and hopes, in this world, stories function like that long, strong lever. Deep and true stories have the power to move us, to pry us loose from the stuck places in which we find ourselves wedged again and again. But like Archimedes, we too need a place to stand. Where do we stand? Where can we stand? I'm reminded at this point of a story about the philosopher William James, who once, in a lecture on the origins of the universe, laid out the then current scientific paradigm. And after the lecture, he was approached by an elderly woman who said, "Now, Professor James, I must tell you, you have it all wrong. I happen to know that the world stands on the back of a giant turtle." I heard this story last week. The skeptical philosopher couldn't help himself from responding, "Well, that's very interesting, but I must ask, what does that turtle stand upon?" And the woman answered, "I see where you're going, but it's no use, Professor James, it's turtles all the way down." I don't know about the turtles, but I know that in the world that human beings inhabit, it is stories all the way down. As the Minnesota poet Muriel Rukeyser says, the universe is made not of atoms, but of stories. In other words, stories are not merely some entertaining embroidery on the surface of our lives. They are the very warp and woof that make up the fabric of our lives and ourselves. Where do we stand then to share our stories? My answer is that we stand on the solid, sacred ground of community. In a gathered congregation such as this one, a religious community is a place where we discover how our personal stories intersect and interact with the stories of others and with the great stories of the world's wisdom traditions. The gathered congregation is a community that listens into speech the stories of our lives. That phrase, listening into speech, comes from the feminist theologian Nell Morton. In her book, The Journey is Home, Morton presents a creative rereading of the account in the first chapter of the book of Genesis, which I began to read earlier. The original creative act, she says, did not consist of God's unilateral pronouncement, this is the way it's going to be in my world. No, it was rather an act of divine listening, an act of listening so deep, so intense, so absolute that it calls forth into being those creaturely voices that are yearning to be heard. That's a myth, a story. The world does break all of us sooner or later. And afterward, many are strong at the broken places. Such persons may become wounded healers, capable of deep listening, understanding, and healing others' pains. Some people do not recover, do not heal. Some people remain bitter and broken, fractured and frightened. Some people live within the story of victimhood and continue to inflict damage upon themselves and upon others. How is this that some people heal and others do not? Much of that, I confess, remains a mystery to me. I'm not sure, but I do think it has something to do with whether or not one has found a way and a place to tell one's story. Healing can happen if one has found a story that is large enough to contain and express the traumas and losses of life, as well as its joys and triumphs. It depends on whether one has been listened into grief and allowed that grief to be released in a story. The great Danish writer Isak Dinesen said that almost any grief can be borne, provided that it can be put in the form of a story. Religious community is, I believe, first and finally, a place where sacred stories are shared. In the process of sharing our tales of grief and gladness, of justice and love, stories of birth and death, of healing and forgiveness, stories of loss and recovery, of courage and compassion. In sharing those stories, we come to understand ourselves and one another more deeply, more honestly, and more compassionately. In speaking and hearing the creative word, then, it is possible for us to begin again, even after our train wrecks, our experiences of trauma and loss. It happens every time we gather together the scattered sacred fragments of our personal and communal life stories, when we weave together our own creation myths, our own recreation stories. Every creation is therefore a recreation. And our gathering in community, in this community, is where creation continues, even today, once upon a time, in the beginning. Amen.